Hello, everybody. This is Stephen Whitfield, a drilling contractor here at the 2023 IADC Drilling Onshore Conference in Houston, Texas. With me right now is Matt Fitzsimmons, Senior VP of Supply Chain Research at Rystad Energy. It's an IADC conference. We're going to have some kind of market outlook. And so, of course, Matt gave a little bit of a look into sort of what we're going to see in the markets. We'll talk a little bit about where that's all going. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Now, your supply chain, so of course, your first thing that you bring up in your presentation today is supply chain and how critical it is and how we're sort of working to improve it. So what are some of the things that we're going to see in supply chain moving forward?
Yeah, what we've seen is coming out of the global pandemic that we were just in, more domestication of supply chains. So we're seeing, in light of both energy security as well as the over-reliance in a way of global markets and what that disruption has been, that we're seeing how can we build in the supply chains more domestically here. And what that means for North American shale is going to be reliance on domestic product, domestic commodities like domestic pipe, and trying to build out in the energy transition supply chains that are going to be built in America rather than relying on these other countries and other regions. So that's not to say that's all going away and that every country is just going to isolate, but what we've seen, especially in light of some of the last few years and the events, whether it be from COVID and the learnings from the supply chain disruptions to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that there's a need for greater capability domestically, and we've seen that out of Europe, we've seen that now in the US, and so we would expect that to continue to increase, especially in light of the energy transition here.
Well, I'll get to Russia in a little bit, but I have another question about sort of energy investment. You're saying that we're going to see an increase in energy investment here near term, so what are going to be some of the factors behind that increase?
Yeah, and I think those increases are going to vary based on the types of supply that we're looking at. So in the upstream globally, we're looking at a 13% increase year on year from 2022 to 2023. However, when we look at North American shale, what we're seeing is roughly a 15% increase in investments. You compare that to things like CCUS, which is experiencing nearly 500% year on year, albeit at a much smaller absolute scale. It's something that's still increasing pretty significantly, right? So CCUS domestically is on the rise. We see geothermal with a near 50% year-on-year growth as well. So these other markets in the low carbon sector are starting to catch up and offering suppliers opportunity for growth. That maybe the 15% growth in North American shale from an investment perspective might not look as attractive as some of the multiple 100% multiples that we're looking at in the other energy types. And so that investment growth in some of these other resources is something that can't be ignored, albeit not the absolute dollars that we're seeing in North American shale.
Let's go back to Russia. When we say that country name, the term energy security seems to come up a little bit. And you talked a bit about energy security concerns and sort of the impact that might have on demand. So where do you see that falling?
Yeah, when we look at what's transpired since Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw gas prices explode because of the reliance on the hydrocarbons out of Europe in particular. And because of that, we saw manufacturing prices increase. We saw all of the things that are needed for day-to-day life, like going out for food and groceries, having to have cost increases, as well as things like heating their home in the winter. And so that drove the demand for other things significantly down. And so you saw the decrease on other commodities, on other goods that were needed, and the new thought, if you will, about the over-reliance from these other countries rather than how can we accelerate on the energy transition to be more reliant domestically, right? So if you don't have the oil and gas resources to go drill and tap into, then you're going to look outside of that in renewables in particular, right? So we saw solar investments from where they were before Russia invaded Ukraine to afterwards increase exponentially. And so the push for that energy security has been one that, especially in Europe, has been extremely strong, as well as what we've seen for the localized here in the U.S. LNG market, seeing many more projects now that are looking for the green light and FID decisions. We saw a few in the first quarter of this year, and we'd expect more over the next year and a half to also help on that energy transition and energy security journey, because of the ability to be able to move around those hydrocarbons as well, especially in the intermittency that you'll see from a renewable source of electricity.
All right, my last question, I'll bring this a little bit more domestically. We're in Texas at a drilling onshore conference, so there are probably a lot of people here that deal in U.S. land. And so the Permian is going to come up inevitably. And you talked about sort of inflation's impact on the Permian right now, particularly with operator costs. So can you tell us a little bit about how that's going to sort of play out? And also, if operator costs are going up, what's the impact that that'll have, say, on the drilling contractor sector?
Yeah, and first I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you for letting me talk energy transition in an onshore U.S. drilling conference, and you've promised to get me out of here safe and sound, and so far so good on that. But when we've seen more seriously prices that have increased this year, I mean, you look at drilling rates from where they were at their low to where they are in the first quarter of this year, they've almost over doubled. And that's for a 1,500 horsepower rig, but we see some room for relief. So when a typical well right now from the fourth quarter of last year to the second quarter coming up where we are now, we see for wells that are being completed, prices are going to show higher by roughly 10% versus where they were, especially out of the Permian. We see prices that have started to level off and prices that are starting to decrease. A big part of that is the supply-demand balances that we're seeing in lower gas prices currently. So gas-rich basins have seen activity start to fall. We saw in Appalachia and Haynesville a near 50% of wells completed falling from where they were in March to where they were in April. And because of that, activity is starting to taper down in those basins, allowing for oversupply in some of the oil-rich basins. And so we expect prices, while they've been astronomically high versus where they were coming into COVID to where they are now, we see some softening, but not a return to normalcy throughout this year and into next year as well. So some good news for the cost competitiveness of North American shale, but also with that not returning to normalcy, the ability for some suppliers to be able to increase margins versus where they were coming out of the global health pandemic. So hopefully a win-win, but time will tell, because there's certainly lots of cloud circling of doubt that could throw us into the next frenzy versus where we've been the last few years.
Well, we'll see where everything goes moving forward here. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. And Rystad's always got good information for us, so thank you again for sharing some of that.
No, I appreciate it, Stephen, and yeah, always happy to talk industry.
And thank you for visiting Drilling Contractor.